This is part 2 in my series on learning to speak the language of brakes. What we're going to do, as I said in part 1, is we're going to go around each wheel and we're going to listen and observe and see what these brakes are trying to say to us. So I want to start with this right rear brake. There's some very interesting things that I'm going to point out to you here because, once again, this rotor and this caliper have been recently replaced. I can still see those machining marks, so this hasn't been done very long ago, maybe only a few hundred miles ago. So come on in close, let me show you what I'm talking about. You're looking at the rear brake assembly on this 1980 Mercedes-Benz. So that means this car's 37 years old. But do you notice this is a brand new assembly right here? Oh, that's great, but then I started poking around this flexible brake hose. There's 4 of them on most of these cars, and they don't get changed. And you know, I've done other videos on this. I've seen these rot internally to the point where they'll actually make it into a check valve where you'll be able to get fluid going this way, but you can't get fluid going the other way. That seizes up the pistons in the caliper and wears out the rotor. And maybe that's what happened here. So before I drive this car, I better replace this, because maybe the reason this has been replaced was because this failed. And look, it didn't get changed. The other thing is, look at how it's all twisted. That means they installed the caliper improperly and put a nice twist and kink to this. And that's not a good idea, because that, particularly on an old brake hose, can cause further internal restriction, leading to uneven and rapidly wearing brakes. So how do you tell if the brake hose has been changed? Look at this. I suspect from the rust and the lack of evidence of these clips or fittings having been removed that this is original of the car. You know, if they've been changed, you're going to see probably bright metal, at least if they've been changed in the last 15 years, and that's what I recommend for my own experience, that you change these hoses every 15 years. And you can keep an eye on these when you do your brake fluid flush, which you should be doing every 2 years. Brake fluid flush, you know, gets so neglected. And that, by the way, is usually what rots the inside of these hoses, because the fluid gets old, it absorbs moisture over time, and it affects the rubber here. So we're going to take this car and we're going to replace all 4 of these hoses. You can see how stiff this one is. That's another clue here. And look at the new one. See the difference? How flexible that is compared to the old one? So this is something you want to check. Anytime you get one of these old Mercedes-Benzes, take a good look at these hoses. If you have any reason to believe they're over 15 years old, change them out. And we do provide these on my website, along with instructions on how to install them and flush kits, so you can also install the new proper brake fluid when you change out your hoses. Together, let's take a close look at this left rear brake assembly. Look closely. Is it saying anything to you? Do you see anything here? I spotted something right away, even before I pulled the pads out. Now, I did pull the pads out. You can see the pads are new, and they're not badly worn. And you can tell this is a new brake rotor, but the caliper is looking pretty bad. And of course the brake hose, you know, sure, look up there. I'm sure that's an original brake hose. It's very stiff. But when I looked at this, I spotted this right here, the color of the rotor. Now let's go back to the right side. Look at the rotor on the right side. These were both put on at the same time, but notice how this rotor has taken on a bluish cast. Now, what do you think that is saying? Yes, that's right. This rotor's gotten hot. And sure enough, when I pull these pads out, this piston, this outside piston, is totally frozen. Now, that couldn't have just happened in a couple months or whenever these were changed, because obviously, look at those pads. That's only a few hundred miles ago. And yet, look at that rotor. It's already starting to discolor. So whoever did this, you know, they didn't pay a lot of attention to what the previous rotor they took off was saying to them. Maybe it was badly scored. Maybe it was so badly worn out that, particularly if it's worn out on one side, let's say one side is extremely scored and the other side is not. You should listen. The brake rotor's trying to say something, because what that means is that particular pad is sitting here as you're driving down the road at 60 miles an hour, is rubbing on the rotor, and that's what's generating the heat. So what I'm going to have to do with this one is I'm going to have to remove the caliper, and I'm going to have to either rebuild it or replace it. And obviously, we're going to change this brake hose. I want to see just how bad this brake hose is inside and see if it is plugged, because this brake hose could have also been one of the reasons why they previously had to change out that rotor. I suspect in this case it's the caliper because of that frozen piston. As we come up to this right front brake assembly, you're already learning something, because I know what you're thinking. You're looking at this rotor and you're saying to yourself, uh-oh, that one looks like it's been overheated as well. And this one is really blue. I know it's kind of hard to see with the light on it, but without the light on it, this is actually a dark blue color. And you can see here the extent of the scoring. It's not so much the scoring. What happens when these rotors get overheated, they kind of get a glaze to them, and the pads also get glazed. So when you overheat a rotor, you're going to experience possibly extreme brake fading under heavy emergency type braking. So this is something you want to avoid. You want to avoid overheating your brakes. This rotor is telling me, wow, this thing really got hot. Now, it could have been from driving, but usually when you see this, it's usually the caliper right here, and sure enough, I took these pads out. It was tough getting them out, and we have a frozen piston. One piston just barely moves, and the other piston, you can't move it at all. Now remember, if the caliper's good, you should be able to pry these or push these out with very light force. You shouldn't need to get a pry bar in there and lean your full body weight into it to move the piston. Because if you do, the caliper needs to be rebuilt or replaced. This caliper is really frozen. And of course, looking at this brake hose, it's stiff and probably, as bad as all the others, knowing they're original. So this brake, it's telling me, okay, I'm done. Now look at this. You're going to say, well, Kent, there's not all that much wear there. There's not a lip. So as far as thickness, this rotor may still be okay. But I just want to warn you, when you overheat a rotor like this, it's very likely that you may have warped it. Now, let's say it's not chattering now, but it might be in the future to say, oh man, I just put new calipers and new pads on, tried to save a little money. Don't take it in and have it turn. It's been overheated. Replace it. Rotors are not that expensive. So when you get an overheated rotor like this, just replace it with a brand new rotor, even if it looks acceptable like this one. Okay, let's move on to the left side. So what is this left front brake assembly telling us? Can you hear it talking? You didn't get the chance to see me pull these pads out. It was harder to get these out than the right side. So we have a situation where this piston on the outside just barely moving. The one on the inside was totally frozen, and the inside of this rotor is heavily scored. And if you look here, this also is very dark. Now it doesn't have that blue cast that the one on the right side has, but if you look in on this side, you can see the blue color, and it probably got more overheated on the inside. But once again, you're looking at this rotor, you're saying, oh, I can get some sandpaper and sand out those little grooves and just reuse this. But once again, from my experience, you do that, 6 months from now, you're going to hit your brakes at high speed and your front end's going to shake. Because invariably, these rotors, when they've been overheated, tend to warp. So the brake's trying to talk to you. Come on, just replace the rotor now and avoid a lot of headache. So after that inspection, I've got to order up 3 rebuilt calipers, 2 front rotors. The rotors in the back are okay. The rear pads are okay. I've got to get some new pads and some new sensor wires. And of course, we're going to get all 4 flexible brake lines. And I'll come back in part 3 and I'll kind of show you some things I run into when I get into this, start replacing these parts. Once again, it's not going to be a tutorial on how to change rotors and pads. But I'm just going to show you some things, maybe give you some tips and things to watch out for when you go about replacing these parts on your own. So be sure and check out part 3.